Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the long dark, to a question the wasteland has never fully answered, the question of what it means to survive everything and still lose yourself along the way. Tonight we explore the real reason ghouls go feral, the biology and the psychology and the darkness underneath both, the truth that the wasteland's human communities have found it most convenient not to examine too closely. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the ruins grow quiet around you. There is no need to hold on to every detail. Simply let the question find you in the dark, gentle, and patient as the glow of something ancient moving through the rubble. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let us begin. The wasteland has a word for what they are, and the word is not kind. It carries within it the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of fear and prejudice, and the specific human tendency to name things in terms of what they look like rather than what they are. And what ghouls look like: the desiccated skin, the collapsed facial architecture, the specific and unmistakable visual signature that the transformation produces in every person it claims is not what human beings look like. And the distance between the two appearances has organized the wasteland's relationship to its ghoulified population in ways whose consequences have been more significant and more damaging than the wasteland's human communities have generally been willing to acknowledge. To understand what a ghoul actually is requires setting aside what a ghoul looks like long enough to attend to the reality underneath the appearance, which is the reality of a human being who survived something that should have killed them and was changed by surviving it in ways that the pre-war world had no framework for anticipating, and that the post-war world has understood, only incompletely and imperfectly across the full span of its existence. A ghoul is, in its most fundamental biological definition, a human being who underwent extreme radiation exposure during or after the Great War and survived that exposure through a process of physiological transformation that the scientific community of the pre-war period had not predicted, and whose specific mechanisms the scientific communities of the post-war period have mapped only partially. The radiation that kills ordinary human beings at sufficient dosages does something to a small and unpredictable percentage of exposed individuals that produces, instead of the death that the exposure should by all biological logic have caused, a reorganization of the exposed person's physiology so thorough and so complete that its results are visible in every aspect of what the transformed person subsequently is. The skin undergoes the desiccation and the necrosis that give the ghoulified individual their characteristic appearance. The musculoskeletal system reorganizes itself around the new physiological reality that the transformation has produced. The immune system, the endocrine system, the circulatory system, all of these are restructured in ways whose specific mechanisms the wasteland's researchers have documented in varying degrees of completeness and understood in varying degrees of depth, and whose net result is a creature who is simultaneously the human being they were before the transformation and something genuinely different from that human being in ways that are not merely cosmetic and not merely superficial, but extend into the deepest levels of biological organization. The most significant and most consequential of these biological changes is the inversion of the ghoulified individual's relationship to radiation, the specific and remarkable alteration that converts the energy source most lethal to ordinary human biology into something that sustains and heals the ghoulified body rather than destroying it. The ghoul does not merely tolerate radiation in the way that certain pre-war organisms had developed adaptations to tolerate environmental toxins. The ghoul requires radiation, absorbs it, uses it as a metabolic resource in ways whose specific biochemistry the wasteland's research has documented without fully explaining, and is healed by exposure to the ambient radiation of the post-war environment in ways that are directly analogous to the healing that ordinary human beings derive from food and rest and the other ordinary resources of biological maintenance. This inversion is not a minor detail. It is the central biological fact of ghoul existence, and it means that the ghouls of the post-war wasteland are not merely surviving in the conditions the Great War created. They are, in a specific and literal biological sense, thriving in those conditions in a way that no other category of post-war survivor can claim. The world that was designed to destroy everything was not designed with ghouls in mind, but it created them anyway. And what it created was a form of life perfectly suited to inhabiting the ruins of what it had destroyed. The ghoulified individual does not age in any conventional sense after the transformation. And this fact, which sounds simple when stated directly, but whose implications ramify outward across every dimension of the ghoul's subsequent existence, is among the most significant and most under-examined features of the ghouls. Ghoul condition. The ghouls who survived the Great War and who continue to survive in the post-war wasteland 2 centuries after the bombs fell are people who have been alive, continuously, and without the biological interruption of ordinary mortality for the entire duration of post-war history. They were people before the bombs fell. They experienced the bombing not as the brief and lethal experience it was for the vast majority of exposed individuals, but as the beginning of a transformation that produced the creature they subsequently became. And they have continued to exist in that transformed state across the full 200 years of the post-war world's development, accumulating experience and memory and loss at the specific and relentless pace that continuous existence in a dangerous and changing world inevitably produces. The vaults preserved some of their populations across comparable spans of time, and the descendants of those populations have their own complicated relationship to the duration of post-war history. But no other category of post-war survivor carries the continuous experiential history that the ghoulified survivors of the Great War carry. No one else has been present for all of it, watching from inside their own continuous and unbroken perspective as 2 centuries of post-war history produced the world that the wasteland's current inhabitants inhabit and take as the natural background of their existence. This means that the ghouls of the wasteland are the wasteland's living archive. They are the only inhabitants of the post-war world who remember the pre-war world from direct experience rather than from the mediated and inevitably distorted inheritance of documents and recordings and the transmitted memories of parents and grandparents who themselves may have been born after the bombs fell. They remember what the cities looked like when they were cities rather than ruins. They remember what the food tasted like when it was food rather than irradiated preserved goods whose relationship to the concept of fresh had become purely historical. They remember the specific texture of ordinary life in a civilization that no longer exists, the social rhythms and cultural forms and ambient sounds and daily pleasures of a world whose absence is now the defining fact of the world that replaced it. This memory is not merely an interesting biographical detail about the individuals who carry it. It is an irreplaceable historical resource, the living connection between the post-war world and the pre-war world that produced it, preserved not in documents that can be damaged or destroyed, but in the continuous, experiential history of the people who lived through the transition and continued living after it. The loss of that resource to feralization is therefore not merely a tragedy for the individual ghoul whose cognitive function deteriorates. It is a loss for the wasteland's history, the permanent and irreversible disappearance of a living witness, a walking archive of what was, whose destruction the wasteland's human communities have too often been too frightened of the creature carrying the archive to mourn adequately. The physical transformation that produces a ghoul is not a single event, but a process. And the process is not identical across all the individuals who undergo it. The circumstances of ghoulification vary significantly, Some individuals are ghoulified by the initial exposure of the Great War's bombing, experiencing the transformation in the immediate and overwhelming context of one of the largest single catastrophic radiation events in human history. Others are ghoulified by subsequent exposure by the ambient radiation of the post-war environment accumulating over time in individuals who were exposed to lower initial dosages, or by proximity to specific radiation sources in the post-war landscape whose concentrations are sufficient to trigger a transformation that more diffuse exposure would not have produced. The specific character of the ghoulification process appears to vary with the circumstances of its initiation. Individuals ghoulified in the acute exposure of the Great War often describe a transformation that was rapid and overwhelming, while those ghoulified by accumulated post-war exposure sometimes describe a process that was gradual enough to be observed from inside as it was happening, which produced a different relationship to the transformation and potentially a different psychological foundation for the subsequent existence within it. The distinction between those who ghoulify with their cognitive function intact and those who begin the process already in a compromised state is a distinction that matters enormously for understanding what happens subsequently. The psychological and cognitive resources available to a person at the moment of their ghoulification, the specific quality of their mental health, the integrity of their sense of continuous self, the degree to which their relational context remained available to them through the transformation appear to influence the trajectory of their subsequent post-transformation existence in ways that the purely biological account of ghoulification does not adequately capture. The person who ghoulifies with their psychological resources intact and their relational connections maintained has a different foundation for the subsequent labor of identity maintenance across extended time than the person who ghoulifies. In the context of acute psychological crisis or severe social isolation or the overwhelming grief of having lost everyone and everything simultaneously, both experiences are common in the Great War's immediate aftermath. Both produce ghouls, but the ghouls they produce are not equivalent in their subsequent relationship to the forces that will eventually determine whether they maintain their cognitive function across the centuries that follow. The glowing ones represent a further stage of the transformation, a category of ghoulified individual who has absorbed so much ambient radiation across the duration of their post-transformation existence that the absorbed radiation has reached concentrations sufficient to produce visible emission, giving these individuals the characteristic luminosity that gives the category its name and that makes them the most immediately visually distinctive of the ghoul types that the wastelands survivors encounter. The specific relationship between the glowing one's extreme radiation absorption and the feralization process is one of the more genuinely contested questions in the wasteland's incomplete science of ghoulification, whether the radiation absorption accelerates cognitive deterioration through the mechanism that the general feralization hypothesis proposes, or whether the factors that produce extreme radiation absorption are themselves associated with the conditions most likely to undermine the maintenance of cognitive function, or whether the relationship is more complex still and involves interactions between biological and psychological and social variables that the available evidence has not yet allowed to be adequately disentangled. The glowing one appears more frequently in feral populations than in intelligent ghoul communities, and this association requires explanation. The explanation, like most of the explanations the feralization question demands, turns out to be more complicated and more interesting than its surface presentation suggests. The wasteland's human population has organized its relationship to all of these varieties of ghoulified individual, primarily around the visual experience of encountering them and the emotional and practical responses that the visual experience produces in human beings who have spent their lives associating ghoulish appearance with the specific danger of feral ghoul behavior. The conflation that results from this organization the treatment of intelligent ghoul appearance as a predictor of feral ghoul behavior, the extension of the fear and hostility appropriate to the feral encounter to the intelligent ghoul who happens to share the feral ghoul's visual signature is a form of discrimination whose practical consequences for the intelligent ghoul community across the wasteland have been severe, and whose relationship to the actual science of feralization is, as this script will document in some detail, not merely inaccurate but actively counterproductive. The human communities of the wasteland fear feralization. Their treatment of intelligent ghouls contributes to producing it. The specific character of this circularity is the darker truth that the wasteland has found most convenient not to examine, and examining it with the honesty it deserves requires beginning where the feralization question itself begins, with the biology, inadequate as the biology alone turns out to be, and with the honest acknowledgement of what the biology can and cannot tell us about why some ghouls lose the thread of themselves across the centuries, and why others, against everything, manage to hold on. The primary scientific hypothesis about what feralization is and what causes it has been available in the wasteland's research literature, such as that literature is, for long enough that it has acquired the specific status of things that have been repeated sufficiently often to begin functioning as established fact, even when the evidence underlying them is considerably more partial and more contested than their repeated assertion implies. The hypothesis holds that accumulated radiation damage to the neural tissue of ghoulified individuals eventually reaches a threshold beyond which cognitive function cannot be sustained, that the same radiation absorption that sustains the ghoul's body, that heals wounds and maintains biological systems in ways whose specific mechanisms even the most sophisticated post-war research programs have not fully explained, gradually and irreversibly degrades the neural architecture that makes the ghoul's mind what it is, wearing away at the specific biological structures that support thought and memory and the continuous experience of being a self in the world, until those structures can no longer perform the functions that make a person rather than a creature. It is a hypothesis that has the virtue of explaining the correlation most frequently observed between radiation concentration and feral ghoul density. The fact that feral ghouls are found in higher concentrations in areas of extreme radiation than in areas of lower radiation, that glowing ones appear more frequently among feral populations than among intelligent ghoul communities, that the progression of cognitive deterioration in ghouls who feralize seems, in the observational record, to track roughly with their radiation exposure history rather than simply with their chronological age or the duration of their post-transformation existence. The virtue of this explanatory consistency is real and should not be dismissed. The correlation between radiation exposure and feralization rates is genuine, and any complete account of the feralization process has to accommodate it rather than explain it away. But the hypothesis's consistency with the observed correlation is not the same thing as the hypothesis's sufficiency as a complete explanation of what feralization is and why it happens, and the specific ways in which the hypothesis is insufficient, the things it cannot account for, the observations it cannot explain, the predictions it makes that the evidence does not bear out, are themselves informative about the feralization question in ways that have not received adequate attention in the wasteland's scientific literature. The most significant of these insufficiencies is the existence of intelligent ghouls who have sustained extraordinary radiation exposure across centuries of post-war existence without demonstrating the cognitive deterioration that the paper radiation hypothesis predicts should accompany such exposure at such duration and such intensity. Raul Tejada has survived 2 centuries of post-war existence in environments whose ambient radiation levels were sufficient to kill ungoulified humans many times over, absorbing across that duration quantities of radiation whose accumulated total would, if the radiation hypothesis were the complete story, have produced feralization long before the point at which he encountered the courier in the Mojave. He has not feralized. His cognitive function across those 2 centuries has not followed the trajectory that the radiation hypothesis predicts. He is sharp and observant, and possessed of the specific quality of ironic intelligence that extended survival under adverse conditions tends to produce in people resilient enough to maintain it, and the presence of that intelligence in a person who has absorbed the radiation he has absorbed across the time he has absorbed it represents, for the radiation hypothesis, an anomaly whose significance the hypothesis has not adequately addressed. Roy Phillips had survived long enough in the radiation-saturated environments of the capital wasteland to present as a functionally intelligent individual at the time of the Tenpenny Tower situation, despite an exposure history that the radiation hypothesis would have expected to produce significantly more deterioration than the evidence of his functioning suggested. Jason Bright had maintained not only his own cognitive function, but the capacity to organize and lead a community of fellow ghouls through circumstances of considerable complexity and difficulty. Despite the radiation absorption that his existence in the Repcon facility had accumulated across the years of his community's residence there, these are not isolated exceptions to a rule that otherwise holds consistently. They are a pattern, and patterns require explanation rather than dismissal as anomalies. The response to this pattern within the radiation hypothesis framework has typically been to propose that individual variation in radiation sensitivity, the same variation that determines which individuals ghoulify, rather than simply dying from extreme radiation exposure, also determines the rate at which radiation damage to neural tissue accumulates in the post-transformation ghoul, and that the intelligent ghouls who have maintained their cognitive function across extended periods of high radiation exposure are simply individuals whose neural tissue happens to be resistant to radiation damage in ways that the less resistant individuals whose feralization the hypothesis was developed to explain are not. This response is not without merit. As a scientific proposal, individual variation in biological radiation sensitivity is a genuine phenomenon, and there is no a priori reason to exclude the neural tissue of ghoulified individuals from its effects. But the proposal's specific form, as deployed in response to the anomalies the hypothesis faces, has the character of a post hoc adjustment designed to protect the hypothesis from evidence that challenges it, rather than a positive development of the hypothesis based on new evidence that supports it. And the distinction between these two forms of theoretical adjustment matters for assessing the hypothesis's actual explanatory status. The FEV connection, the role that the forced evolutionary virus, present in the pre-war environment at concentrations higher than the general population understood, and whose interaction with the radiation of the Great War produced consequences that the scientific community has mapped only partially, represents a second variable in the feralization equation that the purely radiation-focused hypothesis consistently underweights. The pre-war research programs that developed and studied FEV, whose terminal records are preserved in the ruins of West Tech and related facilities, documented effects on human biological systems that extended beyond the musculoskeletal and immunological changes most associated with the virus's public profile into the neurological domain effects on neural tissue, organization, and neural function, whose specific character the research documented with the clinical precision of scientists studying a problem they found genuinely interesting, without the clarity of scientists who understood what they were looking at or what its post-war implications would eventually be. The specific mechanism by which FEV exposure affects neural tissue, combined with the radiation damage that ghoulification involves, may produce a form of neural degradation that neither variable produces in isolation, a synergistic effect whose existence would explain some of the variability in feralization rates that the radiation hypothesis alone cannot account for, and whose specific character might illuminate why certain neural systems deteriorate before others in the early stages of feralization, a pattern of selective deterioration whose implications will become significant later in this account. The FEV hypothesis is suggestive rather than conclusive, and the specific mechanisms it proposes remain underdetermined by the available evidence, which is the evidence of a research tradition that was not organized around the feralization question, and that therefore documented things relevant to that question incidentally rather than deliberately. The West Tech records are records of a weapons development program whose interest in FEV's effects on human biology was organized around its offensive applications rather than its implications for the health and cognitive function of people who happened to be exposed to it. The relevant observations are embedded in the records of research whose objectives were entirely different from the purposes those observations are now being enlisted to serve. And the extraction of meaningful data from this kind of documentary context requires the kind of careful and patient analysis that the wastelands scientific establishment has not consistently applied to these specific questions. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that FEV exposure is a variable in the feralization equation, that its interaction with radiation damage produces effects that neither variable produces independently, and that the specific character of those interaction effects is one of the more important underdeveloped questions in the wasteland's incomplete science of ghoulification. Vault-Tech's research programs, whose terminal records are among the most extensive and most detailed scientific documentation available in the Wastelands archive, generated data about radiation exposure and its biological effects on human beings in the specific and unguarded language of internal research documentation that the program's institutional context produced. The data is embedded in the records of experimental programs whose design was organized around objectives that had nothing to do with understanding ghoulification or preventing feralization, and its relevance to those questions must therefore be extracted from a documentary context that was not created to address them. But the patterns visible in the preserved data across the various experimental programs whose outcomes touched on the variables relevant to the feralization question are consistent with an account of feralization that involves multiple interacting variables rather than a single causal mechanism. The Vault-Tech researchers who documented the biological effects of sustained radiation exposure on their captive populations were not studying feralization, but they were studying the biological systems whose behavior the feralization hypothesis invokes. In the specific population people exposed to radiation in the post-war environment, whose subsequent trajectory the feralization hypothesis is attempting to explain, and the specific patterns their documentation reveals are not consistent with a simple, single variable account of what the exposure produces. The Institute's Division of Bioscience represents the most sophisticated, sustained scientific engagement with the biology of post-war human transformation that the Wasteland's institutional history records, and its terminal archives preserve a body of research documentation whose depth and precision exceed anything produced by the independent research community operating outside its walls. The Institute's researchers had access to laboratory equipment, research populations, the accumulated pre-war scientific literature, and the sustained institutional support that the independent wasteland researcher could not replicate. And the quality of their work reflects these advantages in ways that are visible even in the carefully constructed language of their official research documentation. Their analysis of ghoulification, pursued as part of a broader research program into the biological mechanisms of post-war human transformation, produced conclusions about the neural basis of the feralization process that represent the closest available approach to a complete biological account of what feralization is. Those conclusions are notable, and this cannot be emphasized enough, not only for what they establish, but for what they decline to establish, for the specific and careful honesty of their acknowledgement that the biological analysis the Institute's researchers were capable of conducting did not fully account for the feralization process they were studying. The official research documentation acknowledges, in the measured and carefully qualified language of institutional scientific communication, that fertilization rates across the observed ghoul population do not distribute in the pattern that would be predicted if radiation exposure were the primary causal variable, that the correlation between radiation exposure, fertilization, while real and significant, accounts for less of the observed variance in fertilization outcomes than the radiation hypothesis predicts it should. The residual variance, the portion of the difference between ghouls who fertilize and ghouls who do not, that radiation exposure and FEV interaction cannot account for, is acknowledged in the research documentation as requiring explanation that the biological analysis available to the researchers could not provide. The specific nature of the variables that might account for the residual variance is not named in the official documentation, because the institutional framework within which the research was conducted was not designed to address those variables, and the scientific language available to the researchers was not equipped to name them with the precision that official scientific documentation demands. But the acknowledgement of their existence is itself significant, because it is the Institute's honest admission that the biological story is incomplete, that fertilization has dimensions that the best biological science available in the wasteland cannot fully explain, and that any complete account of the phenomenon must address dimensions that lie outside the biological frame. What lies outside the biological frame, and what the biological science consistently points toward without being equipped to enter, is the territory of psychology and memory and identity, and the specific character of what happens to a person's experience of being a continuous self in the world across 2 centuries of post-war existence in conditions that were never designed to support that continuity, and that have actively worked against it in ways that the biological variables alone do not capture. The science arrives at the edge of this territory and stops, because its instruments are calibrated for biological measurement, and the things most relevant to understanding fertilization's residual variance are not biological phenomena in any simple sense, but psychological ones, phenomena of experience and memory, and the specific labor of maintaining a coherent sense of self across a duration that no framework developed in the pre-war period was designed to address. The remainder of what needs to be said about why ghouls go feral must therefore be said in different terms, and the terms that the honest investigation of the question demands are terms that the wasteland's scientific establishment has been systematically reluctant to use. The question of what it actually means to have survived 200 years of continuous existence in the post-war world is a question that the wasteland's human population cannot answer from direct experience, and that the wasteland's ghoul population can only answer from inside an experience that the absence of any adequate framework for understanding it has left largely unarticulated. There is no psychology of 2-century survival, because there has never been a need for one. The pre-war disciplines that studied the human mind and its relationship to time and memory and the continuity of identity across the lifespan were developed in the context of human lifespans that did not extend to 2 centuries, and the specific phenomena that 2-century survival produces in the people who undergo it are phenomena for which the inherited frameworks of psychological understanding provide, at best, incomplete analogies rather than adequate descriptions. The person who has been alive for 200 years is not simply an older version of the person who has been alive for 70, is not simply someone who has experienced more of the same kinds of things that everyone experiences in larger quantity across a longer span. They are someone whose relationship to time and memory and the continuity of self has been subjected to demands that the inherited frameworks were not designed to accommodate, and that the individuals subjected to those demands have had to address without the benefit of any tradition of thought or practice developed specifically for their situation. The specific quality of memory across 2 centuries of continuous experience is the first, and in certain respects, the most fundamental dimension of what makes intelligent ghoul existence in the post-war period genuinely different from any other form of extended human survival that the wasteland records. Memory, understood in its full psychological complexity rather than its simple biological sense, is not merely a storage system for information about past events. It is a relational system, a system whose function is not simply to preserve the content of experience, but to preserve the experience's relationship to the context that gave it meaning, to maintain the connections between events and the people and places and social frameworks within which those events occurred and through which they derived their significance. The specific psychological demands of memory across 2 centuries are not simply quantitative, not simply the demands of storing more information for longer, but qualitative, organized around the specific challenge of maintaining the relational meaning of memories across a duration that has systematically eliminated the relationships that gave those memories their relational character. When the people who shared an experience with you die, the memory of the experience does not disappear, but something about its quality changes its relational dimension. The aspect of it that was constituted not simply by the information it contained, but by the fact of its having been shared, becomes inaccessible in a way that changes the experience of remembering it, without changing the information that the memory contains. This is a form of loss that every person who survives others they have been close to knows from some degree of experience, and the psychological literature of grief and bereavement has addressed its character with considerable sophistication. But the degree to which this loss has been studied and articulated is calibrated to the experience of losses that occur within ordinary human lifespans, to the experience of outliving some of the people one has been close to across decades of shared history, not the experience of outliving all of them across 2 centuries, and then continuing to live for decades more in the complete absence of anyone who shares the experiential context within which the surviving person's memories were formed and within which they retain their fullest meaning. The intelligent ghoul who has been alive since before the Great War carries memories of a world that no one else currently alive experienced from the inside. The places those memories are located in have been transformed, in most cases beyond recognition, in many cases destroyed entirely by 2 centuries of post-war weathering and salvage and ecological change. The people those memories are populated with are dead, in every meaningful case their biological descendants, where such descendants exist, are people whose relationship to the context of those memories is the relationship of historical descendants to a history they have inherited rather than lived. The cultural and social frameworks that gave those memories their meaning, the shared assumptions and conventions and systems of value that organized pre-war daily life, and that provided the interpretive context within which pre-war experience was experienced as the kind of experience it was, have been replaced by frameworks so different that the translation between them is imperfect and lossy in ways that the survivor is perpetually aware of, and the people around them typically are not. The memory persists as information, which is to say it persists as the raw content of what happened, the specific sensory details, the sequence of events, the particular configuration of a moment in time. But it increasingly fails to persist as meaning as the lived experience of something that happened within a web of relationship and significance that made it the kind of thing it was to experience it, rather than simply a fact about the past that the person who contains it happens to carry. This erosion of meaning without loss of content is one of the specific psychological phenomena that 2-century survival in the post-war world produces in the people who undergo it, and its relationship to the feralization question is more direct than the biological accounts of feralization have acknowledged. The maintenance of a coherent and continuous sense of personal identity across 2 centuries of post-war existence is not a passive process that happens automatically as a byproduct of biological survival. It is active labor, the specific and demanding cognitive and psychological work of maintaining the connections between who one is now and who one was before, of keeping the thread of the self continuous through the accumulated changes of circumstance and environment and relationship that 2 centuries of post-war existence produce, of finding the specific through line of personal identity that connects the person eating irradiated food in a wasteland settlement to the person who ate in a diner in a city that no longer exists and that no one else currently alive remembers from the inside. The thread of that continuity is not maintained by the passage of time, but against it, against the specific and relentless pressure of time's elimination of the relational context that gives the thread its substance and its direction. This labor is demanding in a way that has no adequate parallel in the psychological literature that the pre-war world developed, because the pre-war world never had occasion to study what this specific form of labor involves, or what resources it requires, or what happens when those resources are insufficient to sustain it over the full duration that ghoul lifespans make necessary. The closest analogies available are the experiences of people who have survived catastrophic loss, the complete destruction of their social world, the elimination of everyone and everything that constituted the relational context of their identity, and who have subsequently been required to rebuild themselves within a new context, rather than continuing to inhabit the old one. The literature on this kind of survival is substantial, and its insights are genuine, but it is calibrated to the experience of people who survived catastrophic loss and then lived for another decade or 2 or 3 within the rebuilt context, not people who survived catastrophic loss and then continued to exist for 2 centuries in the ruins of the world that produced the loss, in close proximity to the physical evidence of everything that was destroyed, without the biological deadline that for ordinary human survivors eventually brings the period of post-catastrophe existence to a close. The intelligent ghouls, who have maintained their cognitive function across the greatest spans of post-war time, have done so through mechanisms that vary from person to person, but that share a common character: the specific refusal, maintained against considerable pressure, to allow the distance between the present and the original context of their identity to sever the thread of continuity that connects their current self to the history that produced them. Raoul has maintained that thread through the specific and daily engagement with the skills and the relationships that have given his existence a structure of purposeful continuity, through his identity as a mechanic, as a person capable of maintaining and repairing the technology that the post-war world has salvaged from the pre-war world, which is itself a form of engagement with the pre-war world that keeps the connection between the 2 worlds alive in the specific medium of his daily labor. Hancock has maintained it through the specific and committed engagement with Good Neighbor as a community, through the purposeful organization of his existence around the protection and the flourishing of the people he has accepted responsibility for, which gives the thread of his continuity a direction and a destination that the purely backward-looking dimension of long memory alone could not provide. The mechanisms are different, the personalities are different, the specific histories that produced the mechanisms and the personalities are different, but the underlying character of what each of them is doing, the active and sustained labor of keeping the self continuous against the pressure to let it dissolve into something less organized and less purposeful and less recognizably itself, is the same across the diversity of their individual expressions. The moment when the thread breaks, when the labor of identity maintenance across extended time becomes insufficient to sustain the continuity it has been sustaining, and the specific and progressive failure of the relational systems through which the self maintains its coherence begins to produce the behavioral changes that the wasteland identifies as early-stage feralization, is not a single moment in any simple sense. It is a process, with a beginning that is not dramatic and a middle that is frequently not recognized as what it is by the person experiencing it or the people observing them, and an end that is the point at which the person who was doing the labor is no longer present to recognize that the labor has stopped. The Wastelands archive contains accounts partial, fragmented, in varying degrees of completeness and coherence, preserved in the specific and unguarded language of personal documentation, written for no anticipated audience, of people who were in the early stages of that process and who retained sufficient perspective to write about it while they still could. What those accounts describe is not primarily the biological deterioration that the radiation hypothesis emphasizes. What they describe, with a specific and devastating clarity, is the experience of losing the thread of reaching for the sense of continuous self and finding it less available than it was before, of encountering the memories of a life that was once fully inhabited as facts about a past that is increasingly difficult to experience as one's own past, rather than as a history one happens to contain. The most significant variable in determining whether any given intelligent ghoul maintains their cognitive function across the extended duration of their post-transformation existence is not, the observational evidence suggests, the specific details of their radiation exposure history, though radiation exposure is a real variable with real effect. It is not the specific mechanisms of the FEV interaction with their neural tissue, though that interaction is also real and also consequential. It is, with a consistency that the observational record across the full range of intelligent ghoul communities in the wasteland makes difficult to overlook, the degree to which the intelligent ghoul has maintained meaningful connection to a community of other persons, whose recognition of them as a specific and valued individual provides the external scaffolding that the internal labor of karma, identity maintenance requires over the extended duration that ghoul lifespans demand. This is the conclusion that the biological accounts of feralization have consistently resisted because the biological frameworks within which they operate do not have adequate tools for measuring it, and what cannot be measured within a given framework is easily treated as though it did not exist. But the inability of the biological framework to measure the variable does not establish the variable's absence. It establishes the framework's limitation, which is a different and considerably less comfortable conclusion. The relationship between community and cognitive preservation in intelligent ghoul populations is observable across every region of the post-war wasteland, with enough consistency to constitute a genuine empirical pattern rather than a collection of coincidences that happen to point in the same direction. In the capital wasteland, the intelligent ghouls who maintained the most stable cognitive function across the decades of the region's documented post-war history were the ghouls who had managed to integrate themselves into communities, either the specifically ghoul-organized communities like the underworld in the Museum of History, which provided its members with the forms of social recognition and shared meaning-making that community provides, or the mixed communities where ghoul members had achieved the specific status of accepted and valued participants, rather than merely tolerated presences whose ghoulish appearance was overlooked on sufferance. The ghouls whose cognitive trajectories were most clearly deteriorating were overwhelmingly ghouls who had been isolated by the hostility of human communities that refused their presence, by the specific circumstances of their post-transformation history that had placed them in environments lacking other persons capable of providing the recognition their identity maintenance required, or by the accumulated effects of repeated rejection that had led them, through the specific psychological mechanism of protective withdrawal, to seek isolation rather than continue experiencing the specific form of pain that rejection produces in people, required to seek belonging in communities that do not want them. The good neighbor case is perhaps the most complete, available, natural experiment in the relationship between community and ghoul cognitive preservation. Hancock's mayoralty of good neighbor created, through deliberate political choices about who was welcome and on what terms, a community that extended genuine membership to ghouls on terms that recognized their full humanity, rather than their tolerated deviance from a human norm. A community where ghoulish appearance was not the basis for the specific forms of social exclusion that organized most human settlements' relationship to their ghoul populations. The ghoul members of Good Neighbor, who participated in the community on these terms, displayed cognitive stability markedly better than the regional average for ghoul populations exposed to comparable radiation levels, a divergence whose magnitude is significant enough to constitute genuine evidence for the relationship between community membership and cognitive preservation, even in the absence of controlled experimental conditions. The Good Neighbor case is not proof in the scientific sense of proof, but it is evidence, and the evidence points consistently in the direction that the biological accounts of feralization have been most reluctant to look. The discrimination that the wastelands' human communities practice against intelligent ghouls, the exclusion, the hostility, the refusal of social recognition that belonging requires, is not merely unjust in the straightforward moral sense that treating people as less than people is unjust. It is, if the relationship between isolation and feralization is what the observational evidence suggests it is, functionally contributing to the very condition that the discriminating communities use to justify the discrimination they are practicing. The intelligent ghoul who is excluded from human settlements, who is driven by repeated rejection into the isolation of the ruins where the radiation is highest and the human contact most absent, has been placed by the conditions of that exclusion into the circumstances most likely to produce the cognitive deterioration that the excluding community fears and uses as its justification for the exclusion. The circularity of this dynamic is not merely ironic. It is a genuine moral catastrophe, one whose specific dimensions the wasteland's human communities have found extremely convenient not to examine, and one whose examination the honest account of the feralization question cannot avoid. Raul Tejada was born in Mexico before the bombs fell, in a world that still had the specific texture of ordinary life, the particular quality of daily existence in a civilization that had not yet destroyed itself, that still possessed the ambient assumption of continuity that civilizations maintain right up to the moment they discover the assumption was wrong. He was young when the Great War ended the world he had been born into, young enough that the full span of the life he might have lived within that world was still theoretically available to him, still constituted the kind of open future that young people inhabit without particularly noticing it, as the natural background condition of an existence that has not yet been interrupted by anything large enough to make the future's openness feel like something other than a given. The bombs did not kill him. The immediate aftermath of the bombs, the specific and predictable human violence that catastrophes reliably produce in the people who survive them, the collapse of the social structures that had organized the suppression of the violence that human beings are capable of inflicting on each other, the specific form of desperate and brutal competition for the resources that the bombing had suddenly made desperately scarce, did not kill him either, though it killed his family, which is a fact about what happened to Raul Tejada in the weeks after the Great War, that the account of his subsequent 2 centuries of existence cannot be allowed to pass over quickly, because it is the loss that organized everything that followed, and whose weight has been present in every subsequent year of his extraordinary and costly survival. He lost his family not to the bombs, but to human beings who had decided, in the specific moral collapse that followed the bombing, that their own survival justified things, that the social frameworks the bombing destroyed had previously made unavailable as genuine options. The specific quality of grief that this kind of loss produces, the grief of losing people, not to an impersonal catastrophe, but to the deliberate choices of other human beings who could have chosen differently, is a grief that carries within it a dimension of moral injury that the grief of purely natural loss does not, a dimension that the subsequent 2 centuries of Raul's existence have given him an extraordinary amount of time to metabolize without ever quite reaching the resolution that ordinary mortality would eventually have provided. He survived. He was ghoulified by the accumulated radiation of the post-war environment across a period whose specific duration and specific circumstances his account does not detail with precision, which is itself characteristic of the way that very long survivors relate to the earlier portions of their extended histories, the earlier periods becoming, across the accumulation of subsequent time, less precisely delineated in their specific chronology, while remaining fully present in their emotional and psychological character. The ghoulification changed what he looked like, and it changed his relationship to the radiation that saturated the environment he was surviving within. But it did not change who he understood himself to be, and the maintenance of that understanding across the subsequent 2 centuries, the specific and daily labor of remaining Raul Tejada across everything that 2 centuries of post-war existence in the changed world subjected him to, is itself one of the more remarkable achievements that the Wastelands history records, unremarked upon by most of the history's accounts, because it is the kind of achievement that looks, from the outside, like simply continuing to exist. His fear of feralization is not abstract. This is the dimension of Raul's testimony that is most important to hold on to, because the difference between an abstract fear of something and a fear grounded in the direct observation of its occurring in people one has known and cared about is the difference between an intellectual concern and a terror that has specific faces attached to it. Raul has watched intelligent ghouls he knew feralize. He has watched the process across the full span of its duration in individuals whose pre-feralization personalities he knew well enough to observe the specific changes that the early stages produced the particular qualities of their engagement with the world and with the people around them, that the deterioration affected first, the specific things they lost before they lost the capacity to notice they were losing anything. He has watched the thread break in people he knew, and the watching has given his awareness of his own ongoing cognitive function, the specific character of vigilance rather than simple self-knowledge, the constant background monitoring of a person who understands what deterioration looks like from the outside and who attends to his own interior with the specific anxiety of someone checking for the early signs of a process whose eventual presence he cannot guarantee will never arrive. His continued intelligence is not something he takes for granted. It is something he tends, and the tending is itself a form of the identity maintenance labor whose role in preventing feralization the biological accounts have consistently underweighted. What has sustained Raul across 2 centuries, the specific mechanisms through which he has maintained the thread of his continuous self against the accumulated weight of everything that 2 centuries of post-war existence has subjected that thread to, is not a single thing, but a complex of things whose interaction is as important as any of them individually. His identity as a mechanic, as someone whose specific and practical capability for maintaining and repairing the technology that the post-war world has inherited from the pre-war, one provides him with a form of engagement with the world that is simultaneously useful and connecting him to the people who need what he can provide, connecting him to the pre-war world through the specific medium of objects that the pre-war world produced and that his hands have learned to understand through decades of working with them. His capacity for ironic self-awareness, which is both a defense mechanism and a genuine intellectual quality, providing him with the specific psychological distance from the accumulated weight of his history that makes it possible to continue carrying it without being crushed by it, and his relationships, the specific and particular connections to specific and particular people that he has formed and maintained across the years of his extended survival, each one a source of the external recognition that identity maintenance requires, and each one in the specific and devastating logic of extended survival, eventually a source of the grief that the recognition's loss produces when the person providing it reaches the end of an ordinary human lifespan and Raoul continues beyond it. He has lived through the grief of those losses more times than anyone who has not survived 2 centuries could adequately imagine, and he has continued to form relationships anyway, which is itself a form of the courage that his survival required and that his account of it makes visible. John Hancock is the wasteland's only documented case of voluntary ghoulification, and the specific character of his case, the deliberate administration of an experimental ghoulification compound to himself in a moment of crisis that his human body would not have survived, makes him unique in the Buddha Wasteland's record of the transformation in a way that rewards sustained attention rather than simple citation as an interesting biographical detail. The choice to ghoulify voluntarily is one that the Wasteland's general population would, in almost all circumstances, find incomprehensible, because the transformation is universally understood as a loss, as the conversion of a human person into something that looks threatening and that is associated, in the collective imagination of the Wasteland's human communities, with the feral behavior that the intelligent ghoul's appearance superficially resembles. The person who chooses this transformation is, from the perspective of that collective imagination, choosing to become something diminished, something feared, something whose continued humanity is perpetually in question in the minds of the people they will subsequently encounter. Hancock knew this when he chose it. He chose it anyway, which means that his choice was not made in ignorance of what it would cost, but in full awareness of the cost. And the specific reasoning that produced the choice under those conditions is itself revealing about how Hancock understood his own identity and his own relationship to the future at the moment the choice was made. The Hancock who became mayor of Goodneighbor and who has managed that community through the specific and demanding challenges of post-war governance in a settlement organized around the inclusion of people that other settlements have excluded is not simply the pre-transformation Hancock continued in a changed body. He is someone who has been shaped by the transformation and by the subsequent experience of inhabiting a ghoulified body in a world that responds to ghoulified bodies with fear and hostility, and the shaping has produced a person whose specific qualities of leadership and empathy and commitment to the welfare of the people in his care are connected to rather than despite the history that produced them. His experience of discrimination, of being seen as something threatening rather than as someone whose specific and individual humanity deserves the recognition that humanity deserves, has given him an understanding of what that experience does to the people who undergo it, that most leaders of human communities do not have access to from their own direct experience. And his understanding has organized the specific character of what Goodneighbor is under his leadership, not merely a settlement that tolerates ghouls and other marginalized populations, but a community that extends to them the genuine forms of social recognition and belonging that the active labor of identity maintenance across extended time requires, which is something that most of the Wasteland's human communities have not developed the understanding or the will to provide. Roy Phillips sought admission to Tenpenny Tower not as an opening move in an act of aggression, but as an attempt to access a form of community that had been denied to him on the basis of what he looked like rather than who he was. In a context where the people doing the denying were not shy about the nature of their reasons for it. The residents of Tenpenny Tower, who expressed opinions about ghouls in the specific and unguarded language of people who did not expect to be challenged about those opinions, were not expressing a minority view within their community, but the community's mainstream position, the settled and comfortable prejudice of people who had organized their collective identity around the exclusion of beings they found threatening and distasteful, and who had never been required to account for that organization to anyone whose opinion they were required to respect. Roy Phillips had encountered this position and its expression many times, across a span of time long enough to give the accumulation its specific and terrible weight. He was not simply a ghoul who wanted to live in a nicer building. He was a person who had been systematically told, across years of post-transformation existence in a world organized around his exclusion, that the specific community he was requesting admission to was a community that did not and would not recognize him as a person whose presence within it was possible or welcome. The trajectory of the Tenpenny Tower situation, the various forms it could take depending on the choices of the people involved, the specific dynamics that each possible form produced, the outcomes that each set of choices eventually generated, is a study in what happens when the conditions that intelligent ghoul existence in the wasteland creates are pressed to the specific conclusions that their internal logic demands. Roy Phillips was not a straightforwardly sympathetic figure by the time his story reached the point at which others encountered it. He was someone whose experience of the conditions the wasteland had created for him had produced, across the accumulation of time and loss and rejection that his history contained, a quality of bitterness and a willingness to pursue his objectives through means that the intelligent, principled person he might have been in different circumstances would have declined. Understanding what he had become requires understanding what had produced him, requires the specific willingness to see in his hostility and his moral complexity not simply the expression of a character that was always going to produce these particular outcomes, but the legible consequence of a history that a different set of external conditions might have produced very differently. Roy Phillips is what happens when an intelligent ghoul with genuine cognitive resources and genuine human needs is placed for long enough in conditions that consistently deny those needs and consistently refuse those resources any context in which to find expression and return. He is not the exception to the story this script is telling. He is one of its most complete illustrations. Jason Bright represents a dimension of the ghoul experience that the biological and even the psychological accounts of feralization consistently underemphasize. And its underemphasis is a significant omission, because the dimension it represents the role of transcendent meaning-making, of spiritual or philosophical frameworks that locate the individual life within a context of purpose larger than the immediate circumstances of that life, is a dimension of human identity maintenance that the pre-war psychological literature recognized as significant, and that the post-war conditions of ghoul existence make, if anything, more rather than less relevant. Jason Bright had organized the Bright Brotherhood's collective identity around a framework of purpose, a destination, a journey, a sense of special significance attached to the community's continued existence and its collective aspiration that provided the individual members of the community with something that the purely material and biological accounts of survival cannot supply. It provided them with a reason in the fullest philosophical sense of that word. Not a reason to continue existing in the bare biological sense, which the ghoul's radiation-sustained physiology provides automatically and without requiring a philosophical framework to support it, but a reason to maintain the specific quality of engagement with the world and with each other that makes continued existence continuous personhood rather than simply continuous biological process. Whether one assesses the specific content of Jason Bright's framework as credible or as wishful thinking is, for the purposes of understanding its function in the cognitive preservation of the Brotherhood's members, beside the point. The function is real, regardless of the content's epistemic status. Because the function is psychological rather than metaphysical, it is the function of providing a structure of shared meaning within which individual identities can locate themselves and find the specific form of orientation that direction and purpose provide. The members of the Bright Brotherhood who maintained their cognitive function across the years of the community's residence in the RepCon facility maintained it, the observational evidence suggests, in significant part because the community's shared framework gave their individual identity maintenance labor a collective scaffolding that the isolated ghoul must provide entirely from their own interior resources. The community believed something together, aspired to something together, organized its collective life around a shared understanding of what they were and where they were going. And this shared orientation provided each of its members with an external structure of meaning that the internal labor of identity maintenance could lean against and draw sustenance from. The specific content of the belief was less important than the fact of its being shared, and the sharing was less important than the community that the sharing created and sustained. The unnamed ghouls, the ones whose stories the Wastelands archive barely reaches, whose names appear in terminal records and location logs, without the accompanying biographical detail that would allow their individual histories to be reconstructed, constitute the majority of the ghoul experience. And their majority requires acknowledgement even when their individual specificity is unavailable. They lived the daily reality of intelligent ghoul existence in the post-war wasteland without becoming subjects of the larger narratives that produced the documented accounts. They managed, in whatever ways their individual circumstances made possible, the specific labor of identity maintenance across whatever spans of time their survival extended to, without access to the resources that Raoul's skills or Hancock's leadership or Jason Bright's community provided, relying instead on whatever combinations of connection and purpose and the specific and modest daily maintenance of engaged personhood that their specific situations allowed. Some of them maintained their cognitive function, some of them did not. The difference, in individual case after individual case, traced back to the same variables that the named accounts document: the presence or absence of community, the presence or absence of purpose, the presence or absence of the specific forms of external recognition that identity maintenance across extended time requires. Their unnamed and largely undocumented stories are the statistical substrate beneath the named accounts, and the pattern they form is the pattern that the named accounts individually illustrate. The feral ghouls that the wasteland's human inhabitants encounter as threats that they neutralize with the specific moral simplicity that the encounter's immediate practical demands encourage were people. The person who moves through the ruins of a pre-war office building in the aggravated and directionless way of a creature whose purposeful engagement with the world has been replaced by the reflexive responsiveness of something that has lost the architecture of intentional personhood was, before the process that produced what they are now, a specific individual with a specific name and specific relationships and the specific texture of an individual daily life embedded within the social and cultural world of the pre-war civilization. They ate meals and argued with people they loved and worried about things that the bomb's subsequent elimination of the world those things were part of rendered retrospectively trivial, and were, in the moments of worrying, fully and completely themselves in the way that people are fully and completely themselves in the ordinary unexamined moments of a life that has not yet been interrupted by anything large enough to make its ordinariness visible. By contrast, they survived the bombing, they were transformed by the radiation, they maintained, for however long they maintained it, the thread of the continuous self that the transformation had left intact. And then, at some point along the trajectory of their post-transformation existence, through the interaction of the biological variables and the psychological ones, and the social and environmental conditions that the wasteland's discriminatory organization of itself had created for them, specifically, the thread broke, and what the wasteland subsequently encountered was the creature that the thread's breaking had produced. The wasteland tends toward the erasure of the feral ghoul's former personhood, because the practical demands of survival make the feral ghoul's present more relevant than their past, and because the emotional demands of the encounter make the reduction of the feral ghoul to a simple category of threat easier to manage than the full acknowledgement of what the threat used to be. This tendency is understandable. It is not, for that reason, fully honest, and the full accounting that the feralization question demands requires periodically reclaiming what the practical demands erase, requires returning the feral ghoul's former personhood to the account, and insisting that it belongs there, that the person who once inhabited the creature's body makes a claim on the accuracy and the completeness of any honest account of what that creature is and how it came to be what it is. The conventional reading of feralization as a straightforward horror as the loss of the self to a mindless and relentless biological process, as the reduction of a person to a creature, as the wasteland's most visible and most complete expression of what the Great War's radiation and its aftermath do to human beings who survive long enough within its influence, is not wrong in any simple sense. The cognitive deterioration is real. The person who was present before is genuinely not present after, or is present only in the most attenuated and inaccessible form that the observational evidence allows us to propose. The practical danger that the feral ghoul poses to the human beings who encounter them is genuine and significant, and cannot be wished away by the observation that the creature posing it was once someone. All of this is true, and the acknowledgement of it is necessary for any honest account of what feralization is. But the conventional reading's straightforward horror story framing misses something that the honest examination of the feralization question cannot miss without failing in its honesty. Something about the specific conditions that produce the horror that changes the horror's character without diminishing its reality, and that the wasteland's human communities have found it most convenient across the full span of post-war history to overlook. What the conventional reading misses is this: the intelligent ghoul whose cognitive function eventually deteriorates to the point of feralization has been, in the period before that deterioration reached its terminal stage, a person living under conditions of sustained and specific suffering that the wasteland's organization of itself has actively created and maintained. The suffering of extended survival in conditions of isolation and discrimination, and the accumulated weight of unresolvable grief, the suffering of being a person who remembers everything and has lost everyone and is required to continue indefinitely in the ruins of a world that was designed by and for a civilization that no longer exists. Without the community and the recognition and the shared meaning-making that identity maintenance across that duration requires, is a form of suffering that the wasteland's human communities have not taken seriously, because it is the suffering of a population that those communities have organized themselves to not take seriously. And the feralization that this suffering's conditions produce, the specific cognitive deterioration that the combination of biological variables and psychological demands and social deprivation eventually generates in the individuals subjected to them, is in part the product of conditions that the wasteland's human communities have the capacity to change, and have not changed and continue not to change. The darker reading of feralization is not that it is a mercy in any simple or comfortable sense that the feral ghoul is better off than the intelligent ghoul they formerly were, that the loss of selfhood is a gain in disguise, that the process of cognitive deterioration represents a release that should be welcomed rather than mourned. The darker reading is more uncomfortable and more important than that. It is that feralization, for at least some of the individuals who undergo it, represents the mind's eventual response to conditions of suffering that the mind was not designed to sustain indefinitely, the specific and progressive failure of the cognitive and psychological systems most associated with the fees, processing of complex emotional and social experience under conditions of load that those systems were not built to carry across the duration that the wasteland's conditions imposed on them. The neural systems most associated with the specific forms of suffering that extended intelligent ghoul existence in the wasteland produced the systems that sustained the relational processing of complex grief, the systems that maintained the specific anxiety of being perpetually seen as a threat and perpetually excluded from belonging, the systems that carried the weight of 2 centuries of loss without resolution appear. From the limited evidence available about the specific sequence of feralization's progression, to be among the systems most affected in the process's early stages. If this pattern is real and not simply an artifact of incomplete observation, then what feralization represents, at least in its early stages, is not simply the loss of cognitive function in a generalized and undifferentiated sense, but the specific and selective deterioration of the cognitive architecture most associated with the specific forms of suffering that the conditions of intelligent ghoul existence in a discriminatory wasteland had been producing. The systems that hurt the most fail the first. This is a darker truth than the horror story version of feralization, because the horror story version places the horror entirely in the biology, in the impersonal operation of radiation and cellular damage, and the specific mechanisms of neural deterioration, and leaves the wastelands, human communities, with no particular responsibility for the outcome. The darker truth places the horror partly in the biology, because the biology is genuinely there and genuinely relevant, but places it also in the specific social and environmental conditions that the wasteland's human communities have created and maintained for their ghoul populations, conditions of exclusion and isolation, and the systematic denial of the recognition and belonging that identity maintenance across extended time requires. It places the horror, in other words, partly in the choices that the living continue to make, and that they could, in principle, choose to make differently. And this placement is uncomfortable in a way that the purely biological version of the horror is not, because it carries with it a form of moral responsibility that the biological version conveniently does not require. The neurological evidence that is available, and it is partial evidence, drawn from research programs not designed to address the feralization question directly, and therefore not calibrated to capture the specific patterns most relevant to answering it, is consistent with a hypothesis about the sequence of feralization's progression that aligns with the phenomenological account derived from the first-person testimony of ghouls in the process's early stages. The hypothesis proposes that the cognitive deterioration of feralization involves, in its initial progression, a selective pattern in which the neural systems most associated with complex emotional and social processing deteriorate at a faster rate than the systems most associated with basic environmental responsiveness and motor function. This pattern would produce, if correct, an early-stage feralization experience in which the capacity for the complex emotional suffering that intelligent ghoul existence imposed deteriorated ahead of the capacity for basic, oriented behavior, a neurological sequence in which the mind reduced before it lost the ability to respond to the world at all. Its capacity to experience the specific forms of suffering that the conditions of that world had been producing most intensely. The Wastelands research tradition has not taken this hypothesis seriously enough to subject it to the kind of investigation that would establish or disconfirm it with adequate precision, partly because the research programs most capable of addressing it have been organized around different priorities, and partly because its implications, if confirmed, would impose a form of moral accountability on the research. Wastelands human communities, that those communities have shown consistent interest in avoiding. What the hypothesis implies, stated directly, is that the Wastelands' treatment of its intelligent ghoul populations, the exclusion, the isolation, the systematic denial of belonging and recognition, may be not merely correlated with feralization, but contributing to producing it, and doing so through a mechanism that is both biological and social simultaneously. The biological deterioration that feralization involves is real. The social conditions that the Wastelands' human communities have created for their ghoul populations are also real. And the connection between the two, the specific pathway by which the social conditions produce the biological deterioration, through the psychological mechanism of sustained and unresolvable suffering, operating on neural systems with finite capacity to sustain it indefinitely, is the pathway that the honest examination of the feralization question has been, approaching from multiple directions throughout this account. The darker truth that the title promises is not a single dramatic revelation, but a gradually assembled picture of an outcome that is the joint product of biology and choice, of the specific interaction between what radiation does to neural tissue and what discrimination and isolation do to the psychology of the person within that tissue. The horror of feralization is real. The human contribution to producing it is also real. And the second reality changes the character of the first in ways that the wasteland has found most convenient not to examine. The glowing one stands in the ruins like a lantern that was lit in a different age and has never been extinguished, luminous with the accumulated radiation of decades or centuries of absorption, visible at distances that ordinary ghoulish appearance does not produce, recognizable even through the darkness of the wasteland's most irradiated spaces by the specific and cold quality of the light they emit. They are the furthest visible expression of the ghoulification process, the point at which the transformation that the Great War's radiation initiated has continued across sufficient additional radiation absorption to reach a stage that the initial ghoulification did not anticipate and whose character is different enough from the standard ghoul's biological configuration to constitute, in the understanding of many post-war observers, a separate category rather than simply an advanced expression of the same phenomenon. The glowing one's relationship to radiation has progressed beyond even the standard ghoul's inverted relationship with it. They do not merely absorb and utilize ambient radiation but generate it, emitting the accumulated energy of their extended absorption in ways that affect the biological environment around them, as well as their own physiology, healing other ghouls in their immediate vicinity through the same mechanism by which ambient radiation heals ghouls generally, and posing, in high concentrations, a genuine radiation hazard to unghoulified humans who spend extended time in their proximity. The consistent observation that glowing ones appear more frequently among feral ghoul populations than among intelligent ghoul communities has been noted across multiple regions of the wasteland and across multiple decades of post-war. Documentation and its consistency is sufficient to demand explanation rather than dismissal. The most immediately available explanation that the continued radiation absorption that produces the glowing one's distinctive luminosity also accelerates the neural deterioration that the radiation hypothesis proposes as the mechanism of feralization is consistent with the observed association and provides a plausible mechanism for it. But the consistency of the association does not establish the simplicity of the mechanism, and the simplest explanation is not necessarily the correct one, in a domain where the available evidence has consistently suggested that the simplest explanations are insufficient. The alternative possibility that the factors which produce extreme radiation absorption in post-transformation ghouls are themselves associated with the conditions most likely to undermine the maintenance of cognitive function, independently of the radiation absorption's direct neural effects, is at least as consistent with the available evidence and considerably more interesting in its implications. The specific conditions associated with the most extreme levels of radiation absorption in post-transformation ghouls are, observationally, the conditions of isolation and the absence of the moderating social environment that the presence of other persons, ghoulified or not, provides. Glowing ones are found most frequently in the most isolated and most heavily irradiated locations in the wasteland, the places where human presence is minimal or absent, where the ruins are deepest and the ambient radiation is highest, and the conditions most hostile to the forms of social connection that identity maintenance requires. Whether they are in these locations because the extreme radiation absorption that produced their luminosity drove them there, or whether the extreme radiation absorption that produced their luminosity is itself the product of extended residence in these conditions, the accumulation of what happens when a ghoul is isolated in a high radiation environment for long enough without the social moderating influences that the presence of community provides is a question that the available evidence does not definitively resolve, but that the alternative explanation finds more compelling as the primary causal direction. The behavioral role of the glowing one within feral ghoul populations is one of the more genuinely puzzling aspects of the feral ghoul phenomenon. The observational evidence from multiple locations and multiple encounter records documents a consistent pattern whose character cannot be adequately explained by the simple category of shared biological responsiveness to a common radiation source. Feral ghouls, in the proximity of a glowing one, display levels of behavioral coordination, of collective responsiveness to environmental stimuli, of apparent communication of threat information across individuals in the group, of organized movement that suggests something more than the coincidental convergence of independent, reflexive responses to shared environmental conditions that the standard account of feral ghoul behavior as purely reactive, cognitively empty, cannot accommodate without strain. The removal of the glowing one from a feral ghoul group produces, in the consistent observational record, a reduction in the coordination of the remaining group's behavior that is more pronounced than would be expected if the glowing one were simply one member of a group of cognitively equivalent individuals. Something about the glowing one's presence is organizing the group in a way that the group cannot sustain without it. The radiation emission hypothesis that the glowing one functions as an organizing center for feral populations through the biological signaling effects of the radiation it emits, to which feral ghouls, with their inverted relationship to radiation, are specifically sensitive, is the most scientifically conservative available explanation for the observed pattern, and is plausible as a partial account of the mechanism. But it does not fully account for the degree of apparent coordination that the most careful observational records are document in feral populations in the proximity of glowing ones. The specific quality of the group's responsiveness to environmental stimuli that suggests something more sophisticated than simple biological orientation toward a radiation source. The feral ghoul groups that display the highest levels of coordination in these contexts display behaviors whose character is closer to rudimentary social responsiveness than to the simple tropistic orientation that the radiation signal hypothesis predicts, and the gap between what the hypothesis predicts and what the observation records is itself informative about the limitations of the hypothesis. The question of what remains beneath the surface of feral ghoul behavior, whether anything that could be called residual cognition, residual personhood, residual access to the experiential history and the psychological architecture of the intelligent ghoul who underwent the feralization process, persists in the feral individual in any form that could in principle be accessed, is a question that the wastelands scientific community has addressed with insufficient seriousness. The behavioral evidence is genuinely ambiguous, which is not the same as being uninformative. Certain feral ghouls, in certain circumstances, display responses to stimuli associated with their pre-feralization lives, to pre-war radio signals, to the voices of people connected to their pre-transformation histories, to the physical environments of spaces they inhabited before the process that made them what they are now, that are inconsistent with the purely reflexive behavioral profile that the standard account of complete cognitive loss predicts. These responses are not systematic, are not reproducible under controlled conditions, and cannot support strong scientific conclusions. But their existence in the record is significant precisely because of what it would mean if it were real, because a feral ghoul who, in some attenuated and inaccessible form, retains some residual connection to the person they were before, is not simply a creature, but a tragedy in the fullest philosophical sense of the word. A person whose selfhood has been reduced to a whisper rather than silenced entirely, and whose continued existence in the wasteland's ruins is therefore something more and darker and more morally demanding than the encounter's immediate practical framing allows it to appear. The pre-war civilization that produced the conditions for the Great War was a civilization that had, across the final decades of its existence, developed an increasingly sophisticated capacity for identifying the problems it was creating, and an increasingly consistent pattern of responding to those identified problems with measures calibrated to manage their most visible symptoms, rather than address the conditions producing them. This pattern was not unique to the pre-war world. It is recognizable across the full history of human institutional behavior. The tendency of systems organized around existing interests and existing frameworks to respond to challenges to those interests and frameworks, with the minimum adjustment required to maintain functional stability, rather than the more thorough transformation that genuine engagement with the challenge's root causes would demand. But the pre-war civilization expressed this pattern with a comprehensiveness and a sophistication that the terminal records of its institutions have preserved in enough detail to assess with considerable precision, and the specific way it expressed the pattern in relation to the early ghoul populations that the pre-war period itself produced, the individuals ghoulified by radiation exposure incidents that preceded the Great Wars. Comprehensive transformation of the global environment reveals something about the institutional character of the civilization that produced the wasteland that is as important for understanding feralization and its causes as anything the post-war science of ghoulification has established. The early ghoulification events of the pre-war period were documented by the medical and scientific establishments of the time, with the specific inadequacy of institutions confronting phenomena for which their existing frameworks provided no adequate categories. The individuals transformed by high radiation exposure incidents in the years preceding the Great War represented, for the pre-war medical establishment, a category of patient whose condition fell outside every diagnostic framework the establishment had developed, and whose needs fell outside every treatment protocol those frameworks had generated. The institutional response to this situation was not the development of new frameworks adequate to the new phenomena, but the application of existing frameworks in modified forms that were insufficient to the task, and that both the institutions and the people they were supposed to be treating understood to be insufficient. Without that understanding, producing the more fundamental institutional reorganization that genuine sufficiency would have required. Early ghouls were categorized within existing medical taxonomies of radiation, illness, and environmental contamination in ways that addressed the surface features of their transformed biological state without engaging with the deeper reality of what they had become. The specific psychological and social dimensions of ghoulification, the dimensions most relevant to understanding feralization and to developing the interventions that might have prevented it, were not addressed by the medical frameworks applied to early ghouls, because those dimensions fell outside the scope of radiation medicine as it was then understood, and because the institutions responsible for early ghouls' care did not have adequate incentives to develop the expanded understanding that genuine engagement with those dimensions would have required. The social response to early ghoulification was organized around the management of disruption rather than the welfare of the disrupted. Early ghouls were visually distinctive in ways that the pre-war social environment had no existing framework for accommodating, and their visual distinctiveness generated responses in the unghoulified human population around them that the pre-war social institutions addressed primarily through the establishment of containment and separation protocols, rather than through the development of social frameworks adequate to integrating ghoulified individuals into the ongoing life of pre-war communities. The specific word containment is worth pausing on, because it announces the direction of the institutional response to ghoulification before the Great War made the question of that response moot by transforming the entire global environment into something for which containment was no longer a coherent concept. The pre-war civilization's institutions looked at the early ghouls looked at the transformed human beings who were the first expressions of what radiation exposure was capable of producing, and identified the primary problem as the management of their difference from the ungoulified norm, rather than the support of their welfare, as people who had undergone a profound and unchosen transformation and who required a form of engagement with their situation that the existing institutional frameworks were not equipped to provide. This identification of the primary problem organized the entire subsequent trajectory of pre-war institutional response to ghoulification, and the trajectory it produced was one that made the post-war conditions for ghoul cognitive deterioration not an accidental consequence of the Great War's comprehensive destruction, but the continuation, through different mechanisms and in a transformed environment, of a direction that the pre-war civilization had already set. Vault's specific failure in relation to the ghoulification question is a failure whose character is continuous with the broader character of Vault's institutional ethics as the terminal record documents them, across the full range of the corporation's activities. But it has a specific dimension relevant to the feralization question that deserves attention independent of the broader account of Vault's comprehensive betrayal of the people it claimed to be protecting. The corporation had resources, financial, scientific, institutional, that would have been more than adequate to fund and conduct a serious research program into the biological and psychological mechanisms of ghoulification and feralization if such a program had been among the objectives its institutional leadership had chosen to pursue. It was not the Vault-Tec research programs that engaged with questions adjacent to the feralization question, the programs studying radiation exposure and its biological effects on human beings, the programs examining the psychological responses of human populations to extreme and sustained stress, the programs investigating the specific mechanisms by which radiation damage produced the various biological outcomes that the program's experimental designs were calibrated to generate, were programs whose objectives were organized around the corporation's specific institutional interests, rather than around the welfare of the people whose experiences were generating the data those programs collected. The knowledge those programs produced was real and significant, and included observations directly relevant to understanding ghoulification and feralization. The observations existed as data points in research programs, whose purposes had nothing to do with the welfare of ghoulified individuals, and that therefore did not organize the collection or the analysis of those observations in ways that made their relevance to the feralization question visible or actionable. The post-war scientific institutions that developed in the wastelands' various more stable communities had the opportunity to learn from the pre-war civilization's failures in relation to the ghoulification question and to organize their own research priorities differently, in ways that took seriously the specific needs of the ghoul population and the specific questions most relevant to understanding and potentially preventing cognitive deterioration across extended post-transformation survival. The opportunity was available. It was not taken, in any of the major post-war institutional contexts, with the seriousness and the sustained investment that genuine engagement with it would have required. The Brotherhood of Steel's orientation toward the preservation and the controlled deployment of pre-war technology made biological research into the conditions of ghoul cognitive health a peripheral concern at best and an sign of non-irrelevance at worst. The Brotherhood's institutional identity was organized around objects rather than people, and the specific people whose welfare the feralization question was most urgently about were people that the Brotherhood's own institutional culture had mixed and complicated feelings about engaging with at all. The New California Republic's research infrastructure, more practically oriented than the Brotherhood's and more genuinely concerned with the welfare of the populations it governed, was nevertheless an infrastructure organized around the immediate medical needs of its primarily human civilian population, and the more complex and longer-term questions raised by the ghoul cognitive deterioration problem fell outside the scope of the practical and immediate that the Republic's medical research priorities were calibrated to address. The Institute's Division of Bioscience, whose technical capabilities exceeded those of any other post-war research institution, and whose engagement with the ghoulification question produced the most sophisticated available biological analysis of feralization, was an institution whose leadership had made a determination about which forms of post-war human transformation were worth serious institutional investment and which were not. And that determination was organized around the Institute's specific interests and its specific understanding of what the future of humanity should look like, rather than around any principled engagement with the welfare of all the forms of transformed human life that the post-war environment had produced. The individual researchers who took the feralization question seriously, who recognized its importance, and who pursued it with genuine scientific rigor, despite the institutional indifference of the establishments within which they operated, represent the best expression of the scientific impulse toward the honest investigation of genuinely important questions that the post-war wasteland was capable of generating in relation to this specific problem. Their names appear in terminal records and their research notes, preserved in the archive of the Wastelands documentary history, document the specific questions they were asking and the specific methods they were applying and the specific conclusions they were reaching, with the honesty and the precision of people who understood that the questions mattered and who were applying their best capabilities to answering them without the institutional support that would have made those capabilities more effective. Their work was incomplete. How could it not be? Given the resources they were working with and the absence of the collaborative and cumulative scientific enterprise that adequate institutional support would have enabled, and its incompleteness means that the most important questions about feralization remain more open than they should be, given the time that has passed since the Great War and the resources that the Wasteland's more stable institutions have had available to direct toward the problem if they had chosen to do so. The choice not to direct those resources toward this specific problem is itself a form of the failure. This section is documenting the failure not of individual researchers who did what they could with what they had, but of the institutions that had what was needed and chose to invest it elsewhere. What genuine prevention of feralization would have required what it would have demanded of the Wasteland's human communities and their institutions that those communities and institutions were not prepared to provide is not primarily a technical or scientific question, though the scientific dimensions of the answer are real and important. It is primarily a political and moral question about what the Wasteland's human communities were willing to include within the scope of their concern and their responsibility, what forms of life and what categories of person they were prepared to extend the full range of institutional attention and social recognition to, rather than the partial and grudging acknowledgement that the Wasteland's mainstream treatment of its ghoul populations represented. A serious institutional engagement with the feralization question would have required research programs organized specifically around ghoul welfare, funded adequately, sustained across the timescales that the problem's complexity demands, and directed by scientific questions that were calibrated to understand the full reality of what feralization is and what produces it, rather than by the institutional interests of organizations whose relationship to the ghoul population was organized around other priorities. It would have required the political will to extend to ghoul communities the forms of social recognition and belonging that the observational evidence consistently identified as the most significant variables in the maintenance of intelligent ghoul cognitive function across extended time. A political will that would have required confronting the specific forms of fear and prejudice that organized the Wasteland's mainstream treatment of ghouls, and that the Wasteland's political leadership had no particular incentive to confront. And it would have required, most fundamentally, the willingness to see intelligent ghouls as people whose conditions deserved the same quality of institutional seriousness that the conditions of human beings received to extend to them, the full scope of moral consideration that personhood claims, and to organize the institutions of the wasteland's more stable communities around that extended consideration with the same completeness and the same sustained commitment that those institutions organized themselves around their primarily human constituencies. This extension of moral consideration was not made by any of the wasteland's major institutional actors, with anything approaching the comprehensiveness that a genuine engagement with the feralization question would have demanded. The failure is real and it is ongoing, and its ongoing character means that every intelligent ghoul who feralizes in the wasteland's present is feralizing partly in conditions that the wasteland's human communities have. The capacity to change and have not changed, and continue not to change. What intelligent ghouls have actually said about their experience, the specific testimony of people who have lived the reality that the biological and sociological analyses have approached from the outside, who carry within their extended personal histories the direct experiential knowledge that no amount of external observation can replicate, is the form of evidence that the honest engagement with the feralization question most requires, and that the wasteland's scientific tradition has most consistently undervalued. The testimony of those who have undergone an experience is not automatically authoritative in every dimension of that experience's understanding. There are aspects of what happens in feralization that the people experiencing it are in the worst possible epistemic position to describe accurately, precisely because the process involves the progressive loss of the perspective from which accurate description is possible. But there are other dimensions of the experience, the dimensions that belong to the period before that loss has progressed, beyond the point of articulable perspective. The dimensions that are about what extended intelligent ghoul existence feels like from the inside, rather than what it looks like from the outside, that the first-person testimony is the only available form of access to, because no external observation can substitute for the account of the person inhabiting the experience. Raoul Tejada's testimony about his 2 centuries of post-war existence is the wasteland's most extensive and most carefully articulated first-person account of what intelligent ghoul survival across the full span of post-war history actually involves. And its most significant dimensions are not the biographical details and not the specific sequence of events and locations and encounters that constitute the surface narrative of his extraordinary lifespan, but the specific quality of the relationship he has developed across the accumulation of that lifespan to the fundamental conditions of his existence. The weight that 2 centuries of loss has given him is not expressed in his account as simple sadness, though sadness is present in it, but as something more specific and more philosophically complex, a quality of accumulated understanding about what survival across extended time costs, what it requires, what it does to the person sustaining it, that the accumulation of the experience itself has produced, and that no shorter duration of experience could have generated with the same precision or the same depth. He understands something about what feralization is that the biological researchers do not because his understanding is more scientifically sophisticated than theirs, but because it is grounded in a form of direct experience, that theirs is not the experience of watching intelligent ghouls he knew feralize, of observing the specific character of the changes that the early stages produced in people whose pre-deterioration personalities he knew well enough to measure the distance between what they were and what they were becoming, of carrying that observation forward across the subsequent years as a reference point against which he monitors his own ongoing cognitive function. His monitoring is not metaphorical. He describes, in the specific and careful language of someone who has thought about this with the sustained seriousness of a person whose survival depends on getting the thinking right, the specific things he attends to in his own daily experience as indicators of the cognitive health whose maintenance he cannot take for granted, the clarity of his thinking, the accessibility of the memories whose relational meaning he works to keep alive rather than simply their informational content, the quality of his engagement with the people around him, The degree to which that engagement retains the specific character of genuine interest in and connection to specific individuals, rather than deteriorating into the more generalized and less differentiated responsiveness that the early stages of cognitive deterioration produce. He attends to these things with the vigilance of someone who has seen what their deterioration looks like from the outside, and who understands that the early signs of that deterioration are, by definition, most visible to external observers rather than to the person experiencing them, that the self is among the last to know when the self is beginning to fail. The irony of this position is not lost on him. The specific form of courage required to continue inhabiting it across 2 centuries is something that the wastelands' histories of heroism have generally failed to recognize as the form of courage it is. His testimony about the role of connection in his survival is among the most significant portions of his account, both because it aligns with the sociological evidence this script has documented, and because it comes from a position of direct, experiential knowledge rather than external observation. He does not theorize about the relationship between community and cognitive preservation. He describes it from the inside, describes the specific quality of what the presence of people who know him and whose regard for him is genuine provides for the maintenance of the sense of continuous self that his extended survival has demanded. He describes the specific quality of what their loss produces, the specific character of the grief that outliving people he has formed genuine connections to generates in him, and the specific and deliberate choice he makes in the face of that grief to form new connections anyway, to continue investing in the specific vulnerability that genuine relationship involves, despite the specific and repeated pain that the vulnerability produces in the context of extended survival. This choice, the choice to continue being genuinely connected to other people, despite the certainty that extended survival will require him to outlive them, is the choice that his testimony identifies, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, as among the most significant things sustaining his cognitive function across the centuries. The alternative to making it, the protective withdrawal from genuine connection that the grief of extended survival makes perpetually tempting, is the alternative that the observational evidence consistently identifies as the path toward the isolation, whose role in feralization the earlier sections of this account have documented. John Hancock's testimony about the relationship between his ghoulification and his sense of continuous personal identity is unique in the Wasteland's first-person record, not only because the ghoulification it describes was chosen rather than survived, but because of the specific quality of reflection that the choice's deliberateness has generated in his subsequent account of what the choice meant and what it has produced. He did not experience ghoulification as something that happened to him in the way that most ghouls experience it, as an unchosen transformation of a self that had no say in its own transformation and that was required to understand itself afterward, within the framework of a change it did not initiate. He experienced it as something he did, as an act whose authorship was his own and whose consequences he accepted as the consequences of his own choice, rather than as something imposed on him by external forces beyond his control. This difference in the relationship to the transformation's origin, the difference between experiencing it as an act of agency and experiencing it as the outcome of something done to you, appears to have had significant consequences for the specific character of his subsequent relationship to the transformed self that the ghoulification produced, giving that relationship a quality of ownership and integration that the accounts of ghouls who did not choose their transformation sometimes lack. He describes his ghoulified self not as a departure from who he was before, but as a continuation of who he was before through a changed medium, a changed biological substrate that altered the surface expressions of his identity, without altering what he understands to be the identity itself. The continuity he maintains between the pre-transformation Hancock and the ghoulified mayor of Goodneighbor is not a continuity he simply asserts in the face of evidence that would challenge it, but a continuity he demonstrates through the specific character of his ongoing engagement with the world and the people in it. A continuity visible in the quality of his commitments and his relationships and the specific forms of care and protection he extends to the community he has organized his existence around serving. His testimony about what good neighbor means to him, what the specific project of creating and maintaining a community organized around genuine inclusion rather than tolerated presence means to him, is testimony about what his own cognitive survival has required, which is to say, it is testimony about the relationship between community and the maintenance of the intelligent ghoul's continuous selfhood from the perspective of someone who has organized his life around providing for others the specific thing that his own experience has taught him is most necessary. The documented testimonies of ghouls in the early stages of feralization who retained sufficient cognitive function to document their experience from the inside are the rarest and most significant form of primary evidence available about the feralization process, and they deserve sustained attention that the wastelands research tradition has not consistently given them. These accounts are not numerous. They are, by the nature of what they document, produced by people who are in the process of losing the capacity to produce them, which means that their existence in the archive is already a form of evidence about the feralization process, evidence about the specific speed and the specific character of the cognitive changes the early stages produce, visible in the quality of the writing itself and in the distance between the earlier entries and the later ones within any single account. What they describe, across the variation of individual circumstance and individual personality that their authors bring to the description, converges on a picture of the early feralization experience, whose consistency is itself informative about the features of the process that are common, rather than idiosyncratic. The features that belong to the feralization process as such rather than to any particular individual's experience of it. The picture that emerges from these accounts is not primarily a picture of biological deterioration, though the biological changes are present in them and are described with the specific quality of observation that people who are noticing changes in their own function bring to its description. It is primarily a picture of a specific and progressive change in the quality of the relationship to memory and to the sense of continuous self that the account's authors had previously maintained, a change that the authors experience and describe as a loss of access to something rather than as the direct deterioration of a capacity, as the progressive unavailability of a dimension of their experience that had previously been available without effort, and whose increasing unavailability they are noticing with the specific alarm of people who understand what it part means. The memories are still present in these accounts, the informational content is preserved, the specific details of what happened and when and to whom are accessible, but the relationship to those memories is changing in a way that the accounts describe as a growing distance, a quality of increasing remoteness in the experience of remembering that the earlier relationship to the same memories did not have. The memories are becoming artifacts rather than living parts of a continuous experiential history, becoming things that are known about rather than things that are still, in the specific psychological sense that matters for identity maintenance, genuinely inhabited. The accounts that are most complete, that preserve the most extended record of the early stages before the progression interrupted the account's continuation, reveal a specific pattern in what the authors lose first, that is consistent with the neurological hypothesis about the selective character of early feralization's progression. The dimensions of their experience that change earliest and most noticeably are the dimensions most associated with the complex processing of social and emotional information, the specific quality of their engagement with the people around them, the specific character of their relational experience, the the dimension of their consciousness that was organized around caring about and being cared for by specific individuals in specific relationships. The memories of those relationships persist. The specific capacity to inhabit those memories as relational realities rather than simply informational records changes first, before the changes that affect the clarity of basic cognition and the accessibility of factual memory become significant. What leaves first in the accounts of people in the early stages of feralization is the specific dimension of their experience that was most closely associated with the specific forms of suffering that extended intelligent ghoul existence in the wasteland had been producing most intensely. The systems that hurt the most change the first, and if the accounts of people in the process of losing their minds are the most honest testimony available about what the process is, then what the process is, at its earliest and most accessible stages, is a change in the quality of the suffering before it is a change in the quality of the thought. The ghouls who maintained their cognitive function across centuries of post-war existence in conditions that were systematically organized against the maintenance of that function are, taken together, one of the more remarkable demonstrations of a specific quality of human resilience that the wasteland's history records remarkable, not for the drama of their survival, which is by the wasteland's standards unremarkable in its external expression, but for the specific depth and the specific dailiness of what that survival required. To survive biologically in the wasteland is an achievement that the wasteland's conditions demand constantly and that many of its inhabitants accomplish across ordinary human lifespans through the specific forms of competence and luck and adaptability that the wasteland's practical demands require. To survive as a continuous self, to maintain across centuries of post-war existence the thread of personal identity that connects who one is now to who one was before, against the accumulated pressure of loss and isolation and the systematic denial of belonging that the wasteland's human communities have organized themselves to impose on their ghoul populations, is an achievement of a different order entirely, one whose demands are less visible and whose accomplishment is less recognized, and whose failure, when it comes, is treated by the wasteland's human communities primarily as a threat to be managed rather than a loss to be mourned. The things that sustained the ghouls, who held on the specific resources and the specific practices and the specific forms of engagement with the world and with other people that constituted the mechanism of their extended cognitive preservation, were not, in any individual case, extraordinary things. They were the ordinary human goods, applied with sustained consistency to an extraordinary situation. Connection to other people, in whatever forms, the specific circumstances of each individual's survival, made available not the managed and protected pseudo-connection of someone who has learned to limit their emotional investment to prevent the grief that loss produces, but the genuine and vulnerable connection of someone who continues to invest in specific relationships, despite the certainty that extended survival will cost those relationships and has cost others before them. Purpose, the specific quality of oriented engagement with the world that a project or a commitment or a responsibility provides. The sense of direction that makes the labor of identity maintenance across extended time feel like labor towards something rather than simply labor against dissolution. And recognition, the specific and irreplaceable experience of being seen as the particular person one is by other people, whose seeing constitutes the external scaffolding that the internal labor of identity maintenance leans against. These are not sophisticated resources. They are the ordinary requirements of the human self, understood without mystification and without sentimentality, as the specific things that human beings, including the specific human beings who happen to be surviving in ghoulified bodies across the full span of post-war history, actually need to remain, across all the time available to them, genuinely and continuously themselves. The art that the ghoul communities of the wasteland preserved, the music, the stories, the specific cultural forms that the pre-war world had produced and that survived into the post-war period, not in recordings alone, but in the living memory and the living practice of people who remembered creating and inhabiting those forms from the inside, is among the most significant dimensions of the ghoul community's contribution to the wasteland's cultural life, and among the most completely overlooked by the accounts of post-war cultural history that organized themselves primarily around the contributions of the wasteland's human communities. Ghouls who remembered the pre-war world from direct experience carried within them a relationship to the pre-war cultural inheritance that no descendant of vault dwellers or wastelanders could replicate. The specific quality of a person's relationship to cultural forms they inhabited as a participant rather than inherited as a legacy. The specific authority of direct experiential knowledge about what the music and the stories and the cultural rhythms of the pre-war world actually were in the living reality of their inhabitation, rather than in the mediated and inevitably transformed versions that the post-war cultural inheritance had preserved. This authority was real, and its loss to feralization was a cultural loss as well as an individual one. Each feralized ghoul, representing the permanent disappearance of a specific and irreplaceable perspective on what the pre-war world actually was, preserved nowhere else in the wasteland's cultural memory with the same completeness and the same direct experiential grounding. The feral ghoul moving through the ruins of a city that was a city before they were what they are now was a person who ate in its restaurants and walked its streets and lived within the specific and unrepeatable texture of a daily life, embedded in a civilization that no longer exists and that the creature they have become can no longer remember as their own history. The acknowledgement of this fact is the form of honesty that the complete account of feralization demands, and that the wasteland's practical frameworks of encounter and survival consistently suppress the insistence that the story of the creature in the ruins includes the person who inhabited its body before the process that made it what it is now, and that this full story makes a claim on the moral attention of anyone who moves through the same ruins, with the capacity to recognize the claim and the honesty to honor it. The wasteland will continue to manage feral ghouls as threats, the honest account of what those threats once were, and of what produced the transformation from one to the other, and of what the wasteland's human communities contributed to producing that transformation through the specific choices they made about how to treat the intelligent people that the feral ghoul's body previously housed, is an account that the wasteland has found most convenient not to maintain. The most genuine tribute available to the person who once inhabited the creature is to maintain the account with the honesty and the completeness that their former personhood deserves, to refuse the erasure that the practical framework of the encounter encourages, and to insist that the full story be told and held and not forgotten, even in the wasteland, even in the dark, even when the telling changes nothing about the immediate reality of what must be done. The wasteland at night is the quietest version of itself, the specific silence of a world that was once full of the sounds of a civilization and that has been learning, across 2 centuries of post-war existence, to produce a different kind of sound in the absence of that civilization. The sound of wind through the gaps in structures that were built for a different purpose than the wind is putting them to. The sound of water moving through channels that the pre-war world constructed for reasons that the post-war world has mostly forgotten and that the water continues to use anyway, indifferent to the intentions of the people who shaped the channels, and long since uninterested in any of the distinctions that mattered to the civilization that built what the water now runs through. In this quiet, if you hold still enough and attend carefully enough to the specific quality of the darkness in the ruins around you, you can sometimes see something moving, a luminosity that is not starlight and not firelight, but something more specific and more ancient than either. the specific cold glow of a creature who has absorbed so much of the world's changed energy across so many years of surviving within it that the energy has become visible, that the survival has become its own light. The ghoul who moves through the darkness of the pre-war world's ruins carries something that no other inhabitant of the wasteland carries in quite the same way. Not just the memories of what these places were before they became what they are now, though those memories are real and their weight is real, and the specific quality of grief that moving through the ruins of a world you remember from the inside produces is a form of grief that nothing in the wasteland's experience of loss precisely replicates. They carry the proof that survival across impossible conditions is possible, that the thread of the self can be maintained against everything that 2 centuries of post-war existence has assembled against its maintenance, that the human qualities of connection and purpose and the daily practice of caring about specific things and specific people can sustain a continuous identity across a duration that should have been more than adequate to dissolve it. They carry the evidence in the specific fact of their continued intelligent presence in the ruins of the world that tried and failed to erase them, that something in the human self is more durable than the conditions arrayed against it, more persistent than the radiation, more resilient than the isolation, more stubborn than the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of loss and exclusion, and the systematic denial of belonging. The ghouls who held on through the ordinary human goods, applied to an extraordinary situation through connection and purpose, and the specific and daily experience of being recognized as the persons they were by other people, whose recognition constituted the external scaffolding that the internal labor of identity maintenance required. They held on in Good Neighbor and in Underworld, and in the Bright Brotherhood's collective aspiration, and in the specific and daily practice of Raul Tejada's continued engagement with the world and the people in it across centuries of survival that gave him every reason to withdraw from both. They held on not because the conditions were favorable to holding on, because the conditions were systematically unfavorable to it, but because the specific quality of what they were holding on to, the thread of the continuous self, the accumulated history of a life lived fully and persistently across whatever the world subjected it to, was worth the holding, and they knew it was worth the holding, and the knowing sustained the effort through everything that the effort had to be sustained through. The ghouls who did not hold on, who feralized across the span of their post-transformation existence through the interaction of biological variables and psychological demands and the social conditions that the wastelands, human communities, created and maintained, were not weaker than the ones who did, and the failure of their thread's continuity was not primarily a failure of will or of character, but a failure of conditions, a consequence of the specific and systematic deprivation of the things that the thread's maintenance required. They deserved what they did not receive, which was community and recognition, and the specific forms of belonging that would have given the labor of identity maintenance across extended time the external support that the internal labor alone was insufficient to sustain indefinitely. The wasteland failed them in the specific and accountable sense of having had the capacity to do otherwise, and having chosen repeatedly and with remarkable consistency across 2 centuries of post-war history to organize itself around other priorities. The acknowledgement of this failure does not change what their feralized present is, or what the encounter with it requires, but it changes the moral character of the account. That honest engagement with the feralization question demands changes it from a simple story of biological inevitability into the more complicated and more important story of what the wasteland chose and what those choices produced. The question that the feralization story leaves open, the question of whether the wasteland's human communities will, in the centuries to come, make different choices about how to treat the intelligent ghouls who continue to exist within them, whether the pattern of exclusion and discrimination and the systematic denial of belonging that has characterized 2 centuries of post-war human-ghoul relations will persist or be replaced by something more adequate to the full humanity of the people it has been organized around denying is a question that the wasteland's current state does not answer with confidence in either direction. There are communities in the wasteland that demonstrate the possibility of something better. There are individuals in the wasteland, human and ghoul both, who have chosen, against the dominant current of their social environment, to extend recognition and belonging across the boundaries that the dominant current insists on maintaining. The possibility is real. Whether the possibility becomes the practice, whether the demonstration becomes the norm, whether the wasteland eventually chooses to become the kind of place that sustains its most ancient survivors, rather than contributing to their dissolution, this is the open question that the honest account of the feralization story cannot answer but must leave open, because the openness is not a failure of the account but an accurate representation of where the story currently stands. Rest now, wanderer, and let the darkness of the wasteland settle gently over you as it settles over everything that endures within it. The ghouls who held on are still holding on. In the ruins and the settlements and the communities they have built and maintained against everything the post-war world has assembled against the possibility of their flourishing. They are moving through the dark of a world they remember from before it became the dark that they are moving through, touching the walls of buildings they inhabited when the buildings were inhabited differently, carrying within them the complete and continuous history of 200 years of survival across conditions that the person who entered those buildings before the bombs fell could not have imagined surviving a single one of. The thread of what they were is still unbroken in the ones who held on. It persists across all the years that have worked to sever it, as persistent and as patient as they have been, as steady as the specific and quiet light they emit in the wasteland's darkness, illuminating the ruins of what was with the specific radiance of what survived it, glowing not in spite of what they absorbed but because of it. Close your eyes now, fellow wanderer. The wasteland's dark is held at bay by those who learn to light it from within. Let that light be the last thing you carry into sleep, and let sleep carry you gently into the long and quiet rest that the wasteland's oldest survivors have earned 1,000 times over, and that you, in this moment, have also earned. The glow persists, the thread holds. Sleep now.